بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. We concluded last week's lesson by looking at the heart-wrenching story of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam going to Ta'if and trying to convince the people of Ta'if to believe in God, to believe in Allah, and to believe in Him as Allah's messenger and as Allah's Rasul. And I went on to mention that the people of Ta'if, they weren't that friendly to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and instead of saying thanks but no thanks, instead of lightly telling Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that we're not interested, they then started throwing stones at Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They then started throwing pebbles, rocks at Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Zayd bin Haritha radhiyallahu anhu, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's adopted son, who also accompanied Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam for this trip, he tried his best to shield Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the onslaught of rocks and stones and pebbles which was coming to his direction, but he couldn't. And it's mentioned that Zayd bin Haritha radhiyallahu anhu was severely injured, and also Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was severely wounded and injured by this particular attack by the youth and the youngsters of Ta'if. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon leaving Ta'if, then prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the dua which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made was not against the people of Ta'if. He didn't say that, oh Allah, destroy the people of Ta'if. He didn't say, oh Allah, curse and give la'nah to the people of Ta'if. No. The dua which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made out of his humility, out of his humbleness and tawadu, was that he was complaining to Allah about his own deficiencies. Obviously, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the messenger of Allah, he has no deficiency, he has no nuqs or zur. But instead, out of tawadu, he said to Allah, Allah, I pray for my deficiency. I pray that I couldn't convey the message, your message to the people of Ta'if. Then Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam then came, and he then said to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that your dua has been accepted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is listening to your dua, and He has also entrusted the angels of the mountain that if we want, we can order the angel of the two mountains which was either side of the city of Ta'if to destroy the people of Ta'if if you want. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied by saying, no, I don't want this to happen, and I hope that the people of Ta'if, if they do not become believers, but their progeny or their children will one day convert to Islam. Now from this particular story, we can derive two things, two qualities or attributes of a prophet, not just of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but of every single messenger and prophet sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number one is that prophets or anbiya, they do not become disheartened. If they've approached a group of people and they can try their best to convert them to Islam, try their best to convey the message of Allah. Now, if these people don't believe or don't listen, a prophet or a messenger, he does not become disheartened. That's why it's mentioned in the Quran, La tay'asu min rahmatillah, which means do not be disheartened of Allah's mercy. So remember, a prophet or a messenger, he doesn't become disheartened. That's why in this particular case, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't just give up on the people of Ta'if. He didn't say, oh, forget them, they duzakhi, they jahannamis, let's invite Allah's wrath and anger upon them. No, he then said, okay, these people don't convert, but their children, the generation which will come afterwards, they will one day, inshallah, convert to Islam. So that's the first thing, the first kind of usul or the first rule which you can also derive out of da'wah and preaching is never ever become disheartened. When you invite someone, whether to come closer towards Islam or whether you're inviting someone towards the zikr, then you don't become disheartened if they say, oh well, you're talking a lot of garbage, or you're talking nonsense, or this and that, don't become disheartened, because this particular accusation was thrown at Rasuls and messengers. Since Adam alayhi salam time all the way to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whenever they conveyed the message, they were always accused of talking nonsense and garbage. So if we are accused of talking nonsense and garbage when we are trying to convey order of Allah in terms of the dhikr and also sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, tazkiyah and purification, and if we are taunted or if we are accused of talking absolute nonsense or doing something against the Sharia, then we shouldn't be disheartened, because obviously we know in the bottom of our hearts that what we are preaching, when we are inviting brothers, whether to the zikr, whether to come to the masjid, to come to the deen, this is something which is on the right, which is on the haqq, and which is on the truth. So we should, number one, never become disheartened. And the second thing which we can derive from this particular story is also the sifat, or the attribute of forgiveness and mercy of all the prophets, but in particular of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As mentioned in the Quran, rahmatan lil alameen, a mercy of all mankind. So again, in this scenario here, if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted, he could have accepted the request of Jibreel alayhi salam, and he could have said to Jibreel that yes, order the angels of the mountains to destroy the people of Taif. But instead, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he forgave them, and instead he did dua for their hidayat and guidance. And from this we can derive another point, is that whenever we may be in trouble, whenever somebody may have done something to us, we should always try to forgive them. We look at it later, you can't take revenge against someone. If somebody did hit you, then the Sharia does say you can't hit him back. But it is more preferable and awla and afdal that you actually forgive that individual. And that was the case with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, many occasions. You know the persecutions we've been looking at, so many persecutions Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went through. He did not take revenge against a single person, against a single mushrik or pagan of Makkah. If Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted, out of insaf and adl, he could have taken it. If you were to slap me, I could slap you back. That's like mentioned in the Quran, وَإِنْ عَاقَبْتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا عُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ. So if somebody was to do that to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if Rasulullah sallallahu wanted to take revenge, he could have, and no one would have argued, no one would have said that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is doing something wrong. But instead, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his forgiveness, sifat and quality, his attribute of forgiving people and not taking revenge against anyone, any person who did anything against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he always forgave them. The only time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not forgive anyone was, as mentioned in the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, if somebody did something which was against the laws of the Quran, against the laws of the Sharia. If somebody, say for example, committed adultery, and that case was brought to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not forgive that person. Why? Because the Quran, the Sharia is clear that the punishment of adultery is 100 whips. Or if it's a married man or a married woman, then they are stoned to death. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not forgive that person. If somebody was caught stealing and he was brought to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, فَقْطَوْا أَيْدِيَهُمْ, as Allah says, he would implement the cutting of the hand. So it's only when the laws or the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was broken, that's when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would implement the punishment. If somebody did anything against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would never ever get angry, and he would never ever take revenge. And this is what we should also try to implement in our life, that if somebody does anything where the laws of Allah, where the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is being disrespected, then we should, irrespective of whether that person happens to be our relative or not, whether he happens to be our son or not, or our daughter, or our cousin, or our children, we should also speak out and say something. If somebody does anything personally against us, then we should forgive them. That was the quality and the attribute and the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If somebody does anything where the laws of the Sharia is being broken, then you should speak out. Somebody, say for example, is messing around in the masjid, a place which is the place of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, erected for his remembrance, for salah, for dhikr, if somebody is messing around, if somebody is using foul or abusive language there, then you should speak out and say what you're doing. Because this is not my house. If we had done that in my house, then I probably would have forgiven you. But this is the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can't shout loudly in the house of Allah. You can't use foul or abusive language in the house of Allah. If you were, say, for example, in somebody else's house or in my house, somebody came and used foul or abusive language against me, then we could forgive that person. But if he's using it against Allah or against the Sharia or degrading Sunnah, then we should never ever forgive that particular person. Or we should at least speak out. So that was the attribute of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, forgiveness when things were done against him. And also number two, he would never ever be disheartened. Now this is contrary, because you may be thinking that, okay, if that is the case, that all the prophets, they never become disheartened, then why do we hear stories of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَاللَّهَ عَلَى الْكَافِرِينَ قَالَ نُوحُ رَبِّي عَلَى الْأَرْضِ لَا تَذَرْ عَلى الْأَرْضِ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ دَيَّارًا. Where Nuh alayhi salam prayed to Allah and said to Allah, "Oh Allah, destroy every single non-believer who is living on earth." Other stories of the prophets praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and asking for destruction of their own people. Now the reason why is there's a difference between the story of Taif and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the story of Nuh alayhi salam and his people. And the main difference is that Nuh alayhi salam was preaching to his people for 950 years. Every single day he was preaching to them. So it was after 950 years when Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam was at his ending point. He then said to Allah, that, "Oh Allah, these people would never ever become believers. I've tried for 950 years to turn my people, to change my people, but they're not willing to listen." So therefore, he prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted his dua and destroyed his people and his home. But with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was just once he went to the people of Taif. So if it's a one-off situation where they may treat you in a bad way or in a wrong way, then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did not become disheartened, but instead he prayed for their hidayat and guidance. For Nuh alayhi salam, he prayed for his people's hidayat and guidance so many times. For 950 years, it is obvious that at least every day, once Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam must have prayed for his people's hidayat and guidance. But after 950 years had passed, and he realized that these people would never ever become believers, that these people in their taqdeer, kufr and disbelief has been written for them. So Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam prayed to Allah for their destruction. So there is a difference between Nuh alayhi salam's story, because he was preaching for so long, and the story which I have just mentioned regarding Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now moving along with the next part of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam seerah and biography, I'm going to narrate a couple of stories before we then go on to the next part of the seerah, which talks about the miracles of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in particular the Mi'raj and his night journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the two stories which I'm going to mention is linked with a theme which I touched on a few weeks ago, and I think I did mention it once in the Sunday program as well. And that is with regard to the importance of reciting the Holy Quran, and also the effect the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can have on an individual. Before we looked at the story of the Emperor of Ethiopia, Najashi, when he heard the Surah Maryam, he became a Muslim. We read the story of Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab anhu, when he read the words of Surah Taha, he also converted to Islam. Many examples of Sahabas, of big people, of professional people, of non-believers, when they heard the sweet words of the Holy Quran, when they heard the beautiful words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it had such an effect on their heart that they gave up their life of sinning, of gunas. They gave up their life of hypocrisy and kufr, and instantly they converted to Islam. They believed in Allah and they believed in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the first story which I'm going to mention is a story where the jinnat were even affected by the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they even converted to Islam when they heard the beautiful recitation of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's mentioned that a few days after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam returned from Taif, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in a place called Nakhla, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was praying salah. So it was at night time. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was praying salah, and he was reciting the Quran loudly. Now, as you know, the jinnat, they kind of fly around, they kind of like walk around, they're always around. So there was a group of 7 jinnat who came across these words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the beautiful recitation of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the words of Quran. They gathered around and then they went. Now, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was reciting, he didn't realize there was actually a group of jinnat there. He was just reading as normal. But it was afterwards, when he finished his salah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verse. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذْ صَرَفْنَا إِلَيْكَ نَفَرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. So Allah says that a group of jinnat came to you, يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, and they were listening to the Holy Quran. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains that what they did, فَلَمَّا حَضَرُوهُ قَالُوا أَنْصِتُوا. That when this group of jinnat, they came, they gathered around you, قَالُوا أَنْصِتُوا, and they then said to each other, أَنْصِتُوا, be quiet. Everybody hush, be quiet. Listen to these beautiful words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he goes on to say, فَلَمَّا قُضِيَ وَلَّوْا إِلَىٰ قَوْمِهِمْ مُنْذِرِينَ. And when they finished listening to the Quran and the recitation, they then acknowledged and realized that this is the final prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that these words which this prophet was reciting have to be from none other besides Allah. So they then went to the people, munzirin, warning the people of the coming of the final prophet and in believing in this final prophet. And then the verse goes on to say that they went to the people, they told the people that a book has been revealed which is doing tasdeeq, which verifies the book which was given to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. And then they are inviting the people, Ya qawmana ajibu da'i Allah. That, oh my people, the jinnat are saying this, that, oh my people, accept the invitation of Allah, wa aminu bihi, and believe in Allah, yaghfir lakum min dhunubikum, Allah will forgive your sins, وَيُجِرْكُمْ مِنْ عَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will save you from the humiliating azab and the punishment. So that is one example story of the jinnat. Not you and I, not ordinary people, but just jinnat. When they heard the words of Allah, they couldn't contain themselves. It was too much for them. So they returned back and they believed in Allah. They even invited their people to come and also believe in Allah and believe in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, just a couple of things with regard to jinnat. Now, remember, jinnat, they are to a certain extent like angels. They're not restricted by time in terms of they could roam around the entire universe the same way angels can. And they're not restricted by time in terms of in a blink of an eye, angels could go from one place to another. Similarly, jinnat can also very quickly could also go from one place to another. However, also at the same time, if someone's ruh or spirit is connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that ruh and spirit travels even faster than a jinn. And this is quite clearly mentioned in the story about Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam. It's in Surah Namal, where Sulaiman alayhi salam wanted someone to bring the throne of the queen of Saba, Bilqis, to him. So the ayat goes on to say, قَالَ إِفْرِيتٌ مِنَ الْجِنِّ, that one of the jinnat said, أَنَا آتِيكَ بِهِ قبل أن تقوم من مقامك, which means that I will bring the throne of Bilqis so quickly before you even get up from your place, i.e. before you could get up from your place of sitting, within a millisecond I'll be able to get the throne of Bilqis in front of you. Then he goes on to say, قال الذي عنده علم من الكتاب أنا آتيك به قبل أن يرتد إليك طرفك, which means that there was a companion of Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam, whose name was Asif. He then said to Sulaiman alayhi salam that I will be able to bring the throne of Bilqis إليك طرفك, in a blink of an eye. Now, if we look at this particular ayat of verse, Sulaiman alayhi salam's companion, Sahaba, companion, whose name was Asif, his ruh is going to be very, very strong, because he's a companion of a prophet, i.e. Sulaiman alayhi salam. So he is then saying that my ruh, I am able to basically travel in a blink of an eye to go to Saba, where the Queen Bilqis was, and I'll be able to get her throne and then bring it back to you. So from this we can derive that the ruh of someone, when it's really, really strong and connected to Allah, in a matter of seconds it can go, to this place, that place, and that place. Obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala truly knows where exactly it can go, but that's the power of the ruh. So as I was saying, that jinnat are not restricted by time, but humans we are. But however, if we were to train our ruh and our soul to such an extent that it's very connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we can also do, our ruh can also travel faster than the speed of jinnat do. So that was one story with regards to, and there are many stories of jinnat meeting Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam meeting jinnat, because remember, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's bi'asat or prophethood wasn't just for human beings, but it was also for jinnat as well. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he also conveyed the message to the jinnat. Many jinnat during Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam accepted him and believed in him and became Muslims. So that was one story. There's many stories we look at. Many of the meetings Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had with the jinnat took place when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrated to Medina Munawwara. But this is a story of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam meeting the jinnat, or the attendance of the jinnat, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was reciting the Quran, which happened before migration. But the whole purpose of mentioning this story here is to just to make everyone aware, the power of the Holy Quran. Then the reason why as I mentioned this point before, is that the reason why we're finding it difficult to absorb the blessings of the Holy Quran, the barakat, is because our lives are away from the Holy Quran. Because what we do, the way we live, because it's not according to Allah's desires and wills and according to the Sharia. That's why whenever we read the Holy Quran, we find it difficult to absorb the information and find it difficult to act upon the Holy Quran. So that's an example of a jinnat. And as a jinnat, they're more rebellious and more sarkash than even human beings. But, when they heard the blessed words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speech and kalam, they couldn't contain it, and they also converted to Islam. Leave it there for this week. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to what has been said. Wa akhir da'wa, alhamdulillah.
And when we stop here, then